Hello everyone, today we talk about the beginning of the 30 Years' War. This is part of the Habsburgic history series, so it's technically not a military history video, but it explains, of course, one of the most momentous times in the history of Europe, of the Holy Roman Empire. As you know, we talked about the Habsburgic dominions in our early modern historical sort of browsings. This is propedeutic, of course, to the broader explanation of the 30 Years' War, both from a political and military point of view. I really want to resume especially the military historical side of the story, especially battles that we very much like. As you know, I am putting together a massive series that's going to continue forever about modern, also contemporary history, properly from an evidential point of view, just like for anyone who's interested in properly manualistic history, aside from the military insight that is always going to be our main base, my main branch, so to say. Naturally, there are many ways you can interpret the causes of the 30 Years' War. And the religious strife in the Habsburgic territories, of course, has a lot to do with that, not just because, of course, the theater of the struggle was Germany as a whole, and, of course, the imperial authority of the Habsburgs required also the direct intervention in such a crucial matter. But because it does really pertain to an element, say, a dimension of European culture that, as you know, this is something that stood out relatively correctly about, Schwerpunkts features out there on Reddit groups, etc. Is probably the Middle European soul behind this mechanism. It's difficult to understand Central European culture from a political point of view, German federalism, the legacy of the empire, even after the dissolution of the same during the Napoleonic era. But I think it can be extremely useful, not just for much the later history, but in fact for recovering how the world was really at the time. It would be too easy to make sort of a modern and secular history of the 30 Years' War as the ones that you more frequently find out there, right? On Schwerpunkt, we try to contextualize things properly in the moral, personal, cultural temper of the time. It's a huge challenge, but here we try. So, of course, this is not just the, say, Schwerpunkt's video, unique video on the beginning of the 30 Years' War. It's not even meant just as an introduction, but as one of the multiple videos we will make on this topic at different levels. It's incredibly important also in here to realize that the spark that paradoxically would bring the Habsburgic Empire further, it's still quite medieval mechanisms that we described in the past videos about the Habsburgic Empire, ultimately emerge from within the emperor's own realms, right? And this is not necessarily a paradox, but one of the many elements that, even just by being conceptualized, can help understanding better this war, right? Because you could think that, and this is a point that's often been done, especially looking at the Turkish wars, that the reason why states develop is mostly just out of external pressure. But obviously, if you look at the Holy Roman Empire, the German kingdom, and the Habsburgic possessions, there are actually all different things regarding their overlapping or not in certain cases. It really shows you something, I think, more actual in many ways. That is to say, and that is obscured a bit by the same notion of the post-Westphalian war that I honestly reject and never really embraced it or liked. I think it's actually incorrect to presume that there was a post or pre-Westphalian war. Of course, to some extent, there are, by approximation, by convention, some aspects that are worth noticing, because it's not like the treaty, the Peace of Westphalia was empty in that regard, but not in the sort of categorical understanding that we should have a polities or their territoriality, their national identity, etc., that was developed after that. But in fact, and this is very poignant in this regard, because the spark for this enormous tumult, but also in paradoxically also the chance of renovation of the Habsburgic domains, started from the within of the system, and not just, again, like the Habsburgs were Catholic, right? So their possessions were Catholic, and then yes, we know that they didn't quite directly control everything, but within were all Catholic, right? Absolutely not, right? Nor, of course, the let's say the Catholics were absent from on the other side, as especially the 30 Years' War in this sense, in a broader international fashion, especially shows. With the France of Louis XIV essentially creating the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus, by the way. So it's something that makes us look properly within our community. We must acknowledge that the main cause of issues in the world are next to us, everywhere, right? There isn't such thing like, one system is basically immune from shortcomings, or any system is, nor that in that sense rule leads cannot be rightly identified in that sense, and that the struggle, in fact, is not just what happens with the outside, but also what happens in the within. I think, especially in today's world, it's incredibly important to see it. It's really self-evident, it always was. And again, history books tend, alongside, in part, also the notion of the post-Westphalian world, that this would not quite be the case, that there were some sort of monolithic countries you can easily identify by political direction, by national identity, by religious confession, by sort of territorial compactness that can remain unscathed across the centuries. That's not really how things really occur. And especially Central Europe, that really is a different culture within the old continent from, for example, probably the Western one strictly meant. Of course, in a broader sense, this is Western word, but right, there are very different statual and political and institutional developments in Central Europe. Very often are likened just for the 19th century social Darwinism to those guys were more like us in the West, so they're the same. No, there is a very, very solid, radical, abyssal divide between these political cultures. And not knowing that means that you literally don't know European identity altogether. During the 16th century, the Habsburgs struggled to contain, of course, the proliferation of Protestantism across their monarchy. Today I will be saying very banal things, by the way, because we will highlight different chunks of, say, the various prodromes behind this, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the cooperation between the Austrians, the Spanish, in general. I made already specific videos to describe this background, so I leave you to the Habsburgic playlist if you want to go a bit more in depth with them. I also will not actually explain more than much what's the deal with Protestantism, because you got it from other videos, and we will have really to tackle this at some point in very comprehensive fashion. Also in our Catholic history, for our Catholic history, imperial Catholic traditional history series that I just established through a playlist, collecting everything we covered about that, getting lots of views immediately. It's quite interesting, because it's too big, right? If especially you're a Protestant, or you come from a Protestant background, I can't, as Schwerpunkt, immediately talk to you as if you're the error, you're the problem, you're the bad guy, right? So if anything, in a political, historical, and cultural sense, I have to explain what was going on here. And then, if anything, in some history of religion video, we will talk better about what was going on. It's obvious, however, and this is also macroscopically self-evident, that Protestantism was marching truly against the dissolution of a universal imperial Catholic power, right? The Protestantism wasn't providing with any alternative to that, was just basically continuing the fragmentation of of Christianity towards a more sort of modern secular and more subjective and relative view of power, of order, etc. So basically, paradoxically, de-escalating from the top standard that had always existed, even before Christianity, as far as the Catholic ideal was concerned. This, by the way, took, in fact, different forms within the same Protestant countries. How long, for example, in England, that was tendentially a well-equipped culture to still support some substantial Catholic ethos, like to eventually get to the ultimate settlement there. And as you know, not even the Puritans would be endly welcome in England, that maintained some aspects of Catholicism in its church and so on. But that's also something we will come back on likely soon, because I want to resume the series about the English Civil War as well. This, of course, given the Habsburgic imperial role in the moment, regardless of all the issues that had brought effect to the gradual loss in power of the empire through the centuries, and multiple centuries at this point, was intolerable, right? Theologically, morally, scientifically, there are enormous implications here that are not merely just, again, the notion, there was somebody who wanted to maintain a corrupt power that, had relics of, the same bones of the 300 bones of the skeleton of a single saint or whatever, to scam the faithful, etc. I know that there is literally half of the West that through mass schooling, etc., like from a very long time, even before this, of course, since those very times, went on by just presenting essentially what is the Black Legion of Catholic history, that's telling the truth throughout the early modern ages, basically on the fore, when the Protestant Reformation especially broke out. The countries where this happened were basically the most backward, like in Europe, and there is actually some important lesson to be drawn from that as well. This is evident within the same Germany, right, in a very approximate way, because things were much more intertwined. As we were just saying, that the poor North and the rich South were respectively at different levels of power that would remain also throughout the entire 30 Years' War in favor of the Catholics and their actual capacity and general international universal connection through the Habsburgic dynasty, among other factors, but of course the centrality of the papacy and beyond. It's important to talk the history of these other polities. We managed to do something about the Spanish, mostly from a military point of view for the early modern age. We'll keep talking about the papacy. We especially observed its role in the 1683 campaign of the siege of Vienna. In any case, there is really a universe to open about these topics in a serious historiographical sense, and I really hope that we're going to do it also, because throughout most of my life I really wanted to dedicate myself seriously enough to this, and Schwerpunkt offers this opportunity. Another rather conventional and Protestant version of the story is that the Protestants would essentially be the bringers of humanistic principles that champion open inquiry and Erasmian tolerance, inspired by the Dutch scholar Desiderius Erasmus, who advocated for religious moderation and intellectual freedom. It's basically like saying, like in those times' perspective, that today's liberalism or even leftism, when you're basically vectorially directed towards that, is better because it simply, or should presumably, offer everybody the chance for speaking or whatever. This is strongly at odds with, in fact, is an incredibly relativistic and subjectivistic reality, not just because the Catholic world had actually also, through the Holy Inquisition, by far the most guarantistic judicial means of the entire continent, including Catholic secular power, meaning that, if you really, if you committed a crime or you were to be judged anywhere in Christendom, definitely you didn't want to be handled like by Protestant justice and prisons. Like the chances of getting burned at the stake in the moment were radically higher in the Protestant world than in the Catholic one at the time, without mentioning that things like, burning women for witchcraft, already in mid-16th century, papal states were considered ridiculous, whereas in New England, they went on until the 18th century. So there is something that we should really recover about the reality of the situation. It's that, say, Erasmus, of course, you admire the character, the context, etc., but it's a bit like, Voltaire in later times. This, in fact, puritanistic, hypocrisistic smear of authority and authoritativeness that, in the name of some sort of guaranteistic potential, right? Not practice, right? Everybody should be given this, but how are they going to really handle this? I made an entire video, theologically speaking, about properly the necessity of liberty rather than freedom. The fact that, of course, the latter does not belong but to God, and that there must be a specific sense of hierarchy, of authority, of discipline and order. By the way, it's not like the Protestants, especially the most successful states, that definitely did exploit within their own confines the breaking from Catholic authority, and surely also I don't want to use the term oppression because it's too loaded, especially in American political language nowadays, but let's say surely there was something, that there were tolls, right, to pay in order to remain within the system, etc. But we also explained this in videos about for example, the contribution of the Protestant ethos to the development of modern discipline, that there is a level of dehumanization and depersonalization, let's say, in the notion, for example, of the fantassin that has to simply obey those steps and move in that geometrical pattern, even under cannon fire, because he is sort of individually important as much as he is for the wall, but not really in himself, right? The Catholics had, in sometimes even more primitively traditional understanding of certain political societal roles. What I always say is that modernity is an invention, is made up, and that what works is actually traditional in its own regard. And even the Protestant powers did definitely nail something well, not much because they were Protestant, but because, in fact, they continued what is understood as a Catholic, in a sense of a universal moral and scientific legacy, rather than, again, necessarily their affiliation to the papacy or something, because in order to explain the decline of universal authority, you must understand the failure of that the universal authority as well, historically wise. So that's where I come from with that, dialectically and beyond. So again, I'm not going to digress on that. But again, the notion that there was something so primarily pristine and genuine and effective in Protestantism per se, or in its ethics or whatever, it's something that cannot really be immediately identified, nor, frankly, looking at countries like Scotland or Hungary, especially compared to Catholic ones, ever asserted. The fact that, again, peoples like the English, at large, the Dutch, even the Swedes, etc., had their own moment in history, which moments, especially talking about the British Empire, does not, however, equate to any radical escalation of civilization in Protestant countries across Europe, right? That can easily be disproven, frankly. Without mentioning that Protestant cultures today are, say, or at least the post-Protestant ones, and that's the point, are also by far the most atheistic, anti-religious, more modernistic and secularistic out there, which is also something that should really make you think. Again, it's not like in Protestant world everything was bad, or say any success that the Protestants had was fake per se. It did correspond to dynamic, but it also corresponded to a failure of universal authorities, other than just being specifically a success of those specific cultures. Besides, as I was just saying at the beginning, the enemy is within, and sometimes even at the top as well. Notoriously, as significantly, Ferdinand of Habsburg's son, we're talking Ferdinand, the brother of Charles V, the one that had remained basically to rule in Germany, as the Holy Roman Emperor was actually leading and commanding from Spain most of the time. We're talking Maximilian II, 1564-1576. So properly Holy Roman Emperor showed Protestant leanings in his private life and religious practices. Again, this is a very cursory reference. Everybody learns this from history books. I'm not going to digress specifically on Maximilian II's character, but it's absolutely, it would have been an absolutely plausible thing in a time like that at some point, even a Holy Roman Emperor would have some Protestant tendencies that naturally he had to mitigate and counterbalance. In many ways, you can look at famously, at least formally Protestant rulers, think about Elizabeth I, that actually seemed intolerant to many aspects of Protestantism, but she had to play along for just raison d'etat, as it would be become sort of more usual as a saying in later times. And this, again, can go as far as we've seen it in the video about the French Wars of Religion, as a matter of fact, that even Francis I, Henry II at the beginning had pondered the idea of why don't we actually become not just Protestant Lutherans, but Calvinist at some point. It's not like there was always something instrumental about these things that is apparently like a Renaissance Machiavellian kind of thing, but in those times something that would obviously be played on for very pragmatic reasons. Maximilian II reportedly engaged in theological discussions with Protestant scholars and maintained a court that reflected at least his openness to different religious ideas. His successor, the worldly Rudolf II, 1576-1612, turned his Prague court into a center for unconventional ideas, encompassing everything from avant-garde art, such as the Mannerist works of painters like Bartholomeus Spranga, to alchemy, that was a big thing in those years, and a sincere commitment to scientific exploration. This was part just of the temper of the time. It was also a very Catholic thing in many ways. We've made some videos about the Renaissance, the relation with classical knowledge, with tradition, this almost pre-Christian sort of, some people would say paganistic, but it's not the correct word, kind of tendency to test limits and boundaries, etc. This was mostly, again, part of that world of that sense of loss of a center, as it is expressed by the beautiful Baroque art, also imparted by libertinism later on, which, of course, was a shared feeling, especially after the Reformation had happened, right? The 16th century was a dramatic year. We think about the Renaissance, Michelangelo, the art, like the great moment of, again, revival. That's also actually a very Protestant myth to some degree, much less a modernistic one, because admittedly it was cultivated also in Catholic countries, but never underestimate how this was a thing, has been a thing in as a consequence of Anglo-American influence, even on Catholic countries' educations in the last generations. But it was actually a terrible century. For those who lived in it, the sense of the drama, of the tragedies is incredibly pronounced, mostly because of the Reformation. not even just because of the wars that technically stem from that, but this sense of like, where are the authorities that were to regulate this? Like the discovery of the Americas was an absolutely secondary thing compared to this in the mindset of the contemporaries, which apparently, like, again, that's another big distraction. The age of exploration. It's not like Europeans were necessarily so open to that. Like, they were doing that for practical purposes and gains, etc. But that's yet another positivistic, progressistic aspect of the Renaissance that we simply attach to our historiographical narrative of it without really matching the interest or at least the meaning of the contemporaries gave to that. Rudolf II, we talked about in other videos how the Habsburgs at a point shifted their it's a bit erroneous to call it capital, because in fact it wasn't quite a thing like until the mid 17th century, especially in the Habsburgic world. But essentially their court, at least, to Prague as opposed to Vienna, which is also something that seeded some issues among the majority, as we'll see now, Protestants there, in Czechs, that were fine, in fact, with the notion that they could support the actual imperial court in their country, that when instead the Habsburgs took sort of more conservative and rigid stance, that including bringing the court back to Vienna, created further discontent, a sense of, again, alienation, abandonment. Rudolf II's support for Protestant emigre astronomers, Tycho Brahe, who developed, as you know, a geo-heliocentric model of the cosmos, and Johannes Kepler, who formulated the laws of planetary motion, represented the monarchy's most notable contribution to the so-called scientific revolution. That wasn't actually a revolution at all, but that definitely aligned with some more daring and unconventional, at least, approach to scientific knowledge in relation with at least the scriptural interpretation, the dogmas, the doctrines of the time from a Catholic perspective. It was an incredibly political thing. We'll talk about Galilei too, because, as you know, paradoxically, like, his work was commissioned by the Pope. This is something that we that for political reasons basically tended to eventually in fact bring Galileo to in front of a tribunal, and that had previously actually asked him to research that specific topic to begin with. So very often we forget the context, and we create some mythology just out of, again, like the terrible authority that imposed this on it. But what's the role of authority in the world, and what are the limits of that, and what were especially those people challenging authority at the time exactly doing? Because this is not such a straightforward matter as you may think. These court directions, by the way, were typical of the equilibrism of these generations, should be very much contextualized. There is very good courtly history, courtly themed historiography that deserves to be studied, really. But it's also important to look at this more comprehensively. It's not that all of a sudden, like, the Habsburgic dominions were fundamentally Protestant just because the emperor had this ambiguous directions, and in fact it's not like the Holy Roman Empire could simply or would simply dismiss its Catholic mission at any level of their identity and representation. There is one aspect, by the way, that should always be remembered, that the reason why such relative tolerance, why Protestantism existed in the empire, we'll learn now how. Also, and why it was theologically, say, in the moment in which, in fact, earthly authorities had to cope with this, tolerated, was the urgent need to gain the loyalty of all the imperial subjects and muster, in fact, such public support against the Ottoman threat, the Ottoman Turks, whose repeated incursions, such as the siege of Vienna in 1529, more famously demanded a unified front. Probably I will start a mini-series, at least introducing properly the Turkish wars, especially the first part, because we're covering very well at least the second half of the 17th century. We'll continue also with Prince Eugene. But indeed, the costs represented by the Turkish threat prompted the Habsburgs to be very, very careful with going too harsh on Protestantism, being too intolerant. At large, the notion was that, which is the same one through which I explained, for example, why I'm not worried by anti-Western propaganda and any other anti-Catholic beliefs, is that these, by default, traditionally speaking, are not to be considered as a threat, if not indirectly, meaning that they can make people weaker, emptier, voider, because false doctrines do not confer the imperium, right? But it can make other people weak so that you lose the imperium deriving from, say, the quality of the of the people surrounding you, right? And so again, if you were a Protestant, what were also the coercive means statally wise in Central Europe could put you down? Also, again, we will look better at the confessional wars in Germany during the 16th century, because, as you know, through the Cuius Regio Eius Religio, St. Charles V had sanctioned this tolerance, this sort of Proto-Westphalian concept already, that basically the ruler would choose what kind of confession to follow, and this was tolerated in the federal system of the empire. That still had, of course, joint assemblies, tribunals, regardless of the overall scarce centralization of the system. So while the central authorities and the Habsburg archdukes governing Inner Austria occasionally targeted their Protestant subjects, as Catholic authorities they definitely did, together with the church, the prospect of coordinated resistance prevented them from launching a sustained campaign of persecution. In other words, it would have cost too much, and it would have not necessarily even preserved the Catholic faith more and much, because this, again, attempt to repress may have been used by an excuse by others to further gain in the struggle, like to fight for maintaining certain liberty, certain autonomy, passing to the Protestant side. By the second half of the 16th century, the Habsburgic monarchy's inhabitants formed a diverse religious tapestry reflecting both Habsburg moderation and an ethnic variety of their subjects, something that would stereotypically remain a hallmark of the Habsburgic system, even though it was, again, a very much calculated thing and not much of an attitude. Like, if anything, it might have been a display of weakness, but because of the inherent limits of certain powers at the time, again, especially in Central Europe, other states were not having it much easier for that matter. Just, of course, the Holy Roman Empire had a unique role as far as confessional matters were concerned. And, at this time, like Papacy and Empire, very much aligned, as a matter of fact, and they will increasingly be so, again, in history, from their quarrels in the later Middle Ages. Most German-speaking residents of the Austrian, Hungarian, and Bohemian territories had adopted Lutheranism, sort of the standard, as you know, kind of Protestant, and so like also relatively less fanatic level of Protestant belief. This was influenced by the Augsburg Confession of 1530, as had the majority of Inner Austria's Slovenes and Upper Hungary's Slovaks, right? This is interesting because it shows actually that the majority of the same German element and consistent part of the Slovenes and the Slovaks were actually Protestant at this point. Even Vienna, the imperial capital, was predominantly Lutheran by the 70s of the 16th century. What does this mean? You would say, how? How is it possible? So they were really in danger, in constant threat. Not really in that confessional sense, meaning that in this traditional organic society with an ancien regime hierarchy and some sense of vus above, vus below, and as we often say regarding probably the descendants of the Holy Ghost to confer power to the masses, the fact that, again, the majority of the people had sort of counter, regardless of how they would actually be theologically versed, because it's not like these people fully understood too much about the issue from a religious point of view to begin with. This is obvious. This is not really an era where, say, the majority of people have a proper education to understand the deep theological implications of their own belief or confession. That's not how the system works. This is not even how it works today. It also has nothing to do with literacy. In fact, the alleged greater spread among the Protestant communities, that's not the case. The majority of people were poor and weak and dumb and powerless, right? So even if the majority held those beliefs, and this is not a coincidence, by the way, still they work for people that have the upper hand, as in the ancien regime, because at the end of the day, the decisive moral majority of the system leans towards Catholicism. That, of course, is the one on which the entire imperial system rests, and its establishment is elites that are truly the ones that traditionally hold power and maintain it and preserve, paradoxically, in the sense that the same Protestant subjects from the with a stability of the polity against, for example, the hostility of fully fledged Protestant states, right? Where also lots of Catholics existed, conversely, right? Besides, and we've seen it in many other videos, that the Magyars of Hungary had overwhelmingly embraced Calvinism. And as I was hinting at before, it's not like, again, the Protestant heathens, Calvinism can be applied to a state like Hungary that was importantly backwards compared to the other Habsburgic possessions. This choice had, of course, occurred in a very opportunistic sense, particularly after the spread of the Reformed theology in the 60s of the 16th century, under figures like Peter Melius Juhász, that is to say, in the moment in which the Habsburgs and the Ottomans had effectively shared Hungary after the collapse of its Magyar monarchy in the previous generations, especially after Mohács. Of course, the Ottomans, who had the upper hand, fueled the same Calvinism, given more even religious liberty at times than it existed in Habsburgic Catholic Austria. As we've seen also, regardless of the fact that, in fact, the majority of people, even in Vienna, were Protestant themselves. So this tells you, by the way, how much more important other identities existed beyond confession that overlap and reinforce political union and cohesion, and the fact that, again, many Protestant subjects were okay with being subjects of the Catholic Habsburgs. Right, this is also the story. Again, we don't have to imagine a love story, but again, for the time being, that's how the world was, and so you had to adapt. You be thankful and grateful for what you had in many ways. Now skipping the doctrine of grace and works and how the Catholics and Protestants saw this thing differently. Again, they were on average common people, and they just had to think how to survive in that world. Although many Czechs remained nominally Catholic, the majority followed anti-Roman Hussite and Utraquist practices that had actually survived across the centuries, as we've seen in many videos about Jan Hus. They had essentially formalized the Bohemian Reformation, which echoed Martin Luther's teachings. The same Hussites had contributed, if anything, to spread not much theological ideas that would influence the German Reformation in Germany. We also made a video about the German peasants where we explained what was the deal there, even at a societal level, for the spread of Protestantism amongst these rebellious masses that the same Luther said put them down as rabid dogs, as they were. Actually, they, in fact, were put down as rabid dogs eventually by the same Catholic authorities. But if anything, this sense of resistance, right, of armed resistance to the authority, to the state, that again had been a process, has been also from the later Middle Ages, even though in all failed attempts, including the Hussite one, to basically disintegrate constituted order, and in fact had taken on also very communistic and radical turns, especially among the dispossessed, the lesser people. Other Czechs had converted to Calvinism or the more radical church of the Bohemian Brethren. Even there was this pacifist, so a radically extremistic sect founded in 1457 that emphasized communal living. I made a video last year explaining why pacifism, of course, is a probably one of the worst heresies, even probably at a theological level, and especially one to just like undermine the power of the most accomplished in front of God and through works and the Holy Ghost. Interestingly enough, Croatia proper remained instead largely Catholic. Right? The Croatians, as you know, were very old Roman Catholics since their political beginnings in the Middle Ages. There was, however, a fringe area down in the south, the so-called military border, the Krajina, established in the 70s of the 16th century, made multiple videos, again, about the Habsburgic dominions, explaining this situation. This was a defensive buffer against the Ottoman incursions, providing a refuge, and in fact, land for colonization, in fact, in the same defensive sense, for those Orthodox Serbs fleeing Turkish rule. Orthodox that were in fact not particularly sympathetic to the Catholics to begin with. One of the reasons why the Ottoman Empire existed in the first place, given that it was basically the Greeks who opened the gates to the Muslims instead of sort of favoring what would have been a natural expansion of papal Catholic power to the Balkans. Strikingly, among all Habsburg's domains, only the Tyrol, with its staunchly Catholic population and strong ties to the Church, remained virtually unaffected by Protestantism. This is quite fascinating. This is an experiment you can't do even in just contemporary Germany, Austria, Switzerland. Look at random, I don't know, you could check this, but random Facebook profiles of people living, say, in the Alpine zone, as opposed to people living in the sort of more modern, secularized, lower, say, in the Rhineland, in other places that are much more central. And look at how more radically traditional, communitarian, probably older style people are in the Alps compared to the people in the lowlands. It's something utterly incredible, just in terms of properly of societal connections, etc. This is very interesting. I made a video about medieval Tyrol. If anything, we will talk about Tyrolese history, Tyrolean history in other videos. That there is actually more, as you know, especially during Napoleonic era, as far as warfare is concerned, is quite fascinating. Fortunately, also for the Habsburgs, because coping with Tyrolean guerrilla, in fact, was not very, very easy. But again, this country really shows like very straightforwardly Catholic ties and security. It was a role model in Germany. The Catholic Habsburgs found themselves a religious minority within their own lands, at least nominally speaking. That is, noble assemblies that control taxation and local governance to grant varying levels of religious tolerance, in every crown land except the Tyrol and Croatia proper. They didn't need that, right? And in most cases, only nobles and inhabitants of free towns such as Prague or Graz enjoyed freedom of worship under agreements, like, for example, the 1571 Peace of Speyer in Hungary. However, since most nobles were already Protestant, their peasants often followed their lead, creating de facto Protestant communities in rural areas. This is quite interesting because, as we said before, it's really the establishment that dictates the rule. And in fact, it's not like the peasants would know better. They would just follow what their lords did. And in the past days, I made some videos explaining how usually like noblemen can take even... Usually they are more conservative in many matters, but they will take monarchic stances. And of course, at the time, this confessional rite was the easiest, let's say, to exploit, really, especially because, as we've seen, there wasn't much of a way to simply suppress these religious ideas. And this was one of the odd situations in which the Holy Roman Empire found itself in. This policy of tolerance yielded at least some benefit, as outrageous as it was in a broader international, theological, and broader cultural sense. By accommodating Protestantism in some form, the Habsburgs eliminated religion as a source of discord, at least in the moment, because, of course, they were actively paying and suffering for that in, as we've seen, just international prestige, in actual, it was just also a consequence of their powerlessness towards this problem that stained their reputation of an otherwise incredibly pious court, right? There is all a very stern Habsburgic dynastic behavior historically that has a lot to do with, in part, the imitation of the Spanish court, but in fact, mostly that since the Habsburgs didn't have saints in their dynasty, it was a very important aspect. They had to compensate for this sort of more pious behavior that very often corresponded also to a minimalistic. Today, we would say minimalism. Today, when people say I'm a minimalist, it actually means you're poor, right? Let's be honest. And in fact, they didn't have much money to have a luxurious court, fast, etc. So this again was a very, very odd situation, but it sort of promoted at least a measure of coexistence among the monarchy's different population. This was not really tolerance as we understand it in contemporary terms. It was just like the de facto situation that was like a thorn in the side and that was only barely modifiable. In Silesia, that was yet another Habsburgic land, Lutherans and Catholics took turns using churches on Sundays. These seem like also very interesting and, after all, civilized practices that would avoid simply killing each other, within the same church. But that is also presents some important religious, say, ritual, doctrinal issues. A practice that was even formalized in some areas by local agreements to share sacred spaces that is even more tight, as you understand, as a measure. By easing religious tensions, the Habsburgs also ensured the allegiance and backing of their Protestant estates in the ongoing war with external foes, particularly during campaigns against the Ottomans, such as the Long Turkish War, 1593-1606. There was a wild divide between different imperial subjects. Some would even hope the Habsburgs would be destroyed by the Turks, whereas there were, very loyal Protestant soldiers that, regardless of the confessional divide, would fight and die for the Habsburgs. We've seen partly this topic in the videos about the German Peasants' War, in the videos about the Landsknechten. Notoriously, it was full of Lutherans among the soldiers of the most Catholic Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. But again, it's normal. It's like, I don't know, today having I don't know, let's imagine in a NATO country, in the military, you have people who have Russophilic feelings, right? It's not like they're, I don't know, in a war, they're actually going to side with Russia. Just to make an example, they have that kind of attitude towards authority. They have kind of international idea. They have the fucked up understanding of reality. But at the end of the day, they still are trained to still do what they have to do, and they would fight and die in a war at large, regardless of the fact that at least that type of propaganda very often is against war, but it's all a scam, right? Also because the forces triggered by major political conflagrations overwhelm all this sort of petty idiocies that people, let rot and nest in their brains. However, just for saying what other factors can intervene, the Lutheran Germans were apparently much less ruthless and violent and zealous than the Spanish Catholics in the sack of Rome in 1527. By the way, as you know, in 1529, the aforementioned Caesar of Vienna was averted by Landsknecht and had, however, wanted their pay, threatening otherwise, if they had not gotten it, to exterminate the population of Vienna just like the Turks would have done it had they seized the city. Hence, you really never escape the most dreadful consequences of the spread of these ideologies. Then you wonder why the Renaissance was a messed up time. There is no doubt, instead, that the confessional balance within the Habsburgic dominions was disruptive, and that in a sense the rise of Catholic Counter-Reformation, catalyzed by the famous Council of Trent of 1563, while caused more tension in the system, also allowed for the issue to be addressed and to be settled. As you know, Counter-Reformation is a colossal effort to update, reactualize, innovate, and discipline the Catholic Church that yielded enormous results. We discussed this in the video about the 7 churches of Rome recently, talking about St. Philip Neri, for example. This was to renew Catholic doctrine and discipline as a whole. The revitalization and reform of the Catholic Church in the latter half of the 16th century ignited a fervent drive to reconvert the millions of Christians who had adopted Protestantism. It's interesting how this happened really actually close to the Reformation itself, if you look at the dates, really. And it's interesting to think how, not just at the very beginning, telling the truth, but also later, it was really believed that Protestantism could be put down. After all, it wouldn't be the first time in Christian history that a major heretical outbreak would take place. Just universal power was, however, much stronger in the antiquity, in the Middle Ages, for that to be fully accomplished. We talked about this in our videos about Christianity. So you should see Protestantism in this lens, in my opinion, with much greater benefit regarding its historiographical interpretation, exactly to test the power of universal forces, rather than seeing as something like new and unique and whatever. Like most of the ideas that were, aside from the theology of it, that, believe me, it's something you would find enormous parallelism with Arianism, with Catharism. There is a level of Gnosticism, of denial of the works. It's always been there, and being always coming from the fringe in a anti-authority direction, also self-sabotaging your own culture, that in this case had been taking roots. Now, initially, the counter-reformistic effort was spearheaded independently by religious orders, like it had happened also during the Middle Ages. This time also, however, by new ones that were created ad hoc to address this issue. Particularly the Society of Jesus, founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, that was an ex-military man, by the way, which sent missionaries such as Peter Canisius to preach and minister among the Habsburgic monarchy's Protestant communities, establishing Jesuit colleges in Vienna and Prague by the mid-16th century. Over time, as the Catholic laity within the monarchy grew more committed to the Counter-Reformation and confident in its moral superiority, they became increasingly intolerant of the Protestant majority. In the closing years of Rudolf II's reign, a previous hesitant central government, pressured by figures like Bishop Melchior Kelsel, decided to act. This was also very courageous, given the circumstances. Several factors drove the Habsburgs to confront their Protestant subjects. Their own religious convictions, rooted in their Catholic upbringing and reinforced by Jesuit education, undoubtedly played a role, as did the newfound freedom they gained after the Peace of Schwerpunkt, which concluded the 15 Years' War in 1606, reducing Ottoman pressure by establishing a temporary truce. With the Turkish threat diminished, both sides felt less constrained in engaging on one another. Naturally, we're making the extremely long story extremely short, meaning that especially as far as the beginning of the 30 Years' War is concerned, we should make like an enormous digression. Today we don't have the time for just like the situation of the political situation of Bohemia in the empire, the general one in Germany as well. And again, what is important to bear in mind is that regardless, again, of numbers that count up to a certain point, the establishment had remained Catholic, and at large the forces that the Habsburgs could muster were, of course, sufficient, as you know, also during the first phase of the 30 Years' War, to actually put down Protestant rule pretty much across all of Germany, right? And this could not really be maintained, but again, it literally took a foreign intervention in order to unlock the situation. So this picture of, again, Protestant majority, that was not really also the case for many parts of the empire, especially also, say, in Germany, does not mean that, again, this majority was particularly convinced and or convincing to begin with. And again, we if you don't explain how this was concentrated, obviously there were also noblemen from that side, but in general, like this conception was mostly spread among people that did not really have much of an idea of what power really is, right? You could argue just by the doctrine of works from a Protestant standpoint denies that comprehension to begin with, but that's exactly the point. We're talking at a system that is, however, well-rooted in Catholicism, and that has all to gain from reaffirming a Catholic hegemony. Rudolf II and his successor Matthias I, 1612-19, were likely influenced by events beyond the monarchy. Both had been educated at the court of Philip II of Spain, where they observed the devastating impact of religious strife in confessionally divided regions like France during the French Wars of Religion, 1562-98, and the Spanish Netherlands during the Dutch Revolt, 1568-1648. We're looking at figures that had also witnessed the Spanish disaster against England in 1588, so they had really received some of the best schooling in political, religious, international matters at large. That knew, by the way, of the might of the Spanish forces. We described how the same Austrian Habsburgs were largely dependent on that force in a broader sort of concert of powers across the continent. As a result, these rulers became convinced that only a uniformly Catholic society could remain unwaveringly loyal to the crown. It was not just stemming from a Spanish influence; it was truly constitutive of their historical, of the historical order of their imperial tradition. And they were likely emboldened by the example of their cousin, the Archduke Ferdinand of Inner Austria, who, through measures like the 1598 expulsion of Protestant clergy from Graz, had recently made progress in restoring Catholicism in his territories. By the way, at this point, the Habsburgic monarchy had followed sort of different directions, even within the Habsburg, and had different branches, like in the later Middle Ages. So there had been yet another probably weakening of the unity of the entire system, but now things were coming back into more solid, more solid fashion. All right. The motivations could be further expanded. My idea is that regardless of the excesses of that era and the, again, political equilibrism, the situation, traditional, say, power was very deeply understood also in a theological fashion that was much more self-readily evident in the time being, especially among the elites, than today's people's vision of the same. Like saying, look at these groups were living in apparent harmony, or this was just a different way of seeing things. And let's be honest, like the Protestants were actually even more liberal. This is liberal. Like this is not, again, it's not good even to begin with, but it's also something which is properly incorrect from a historical point of view, right? If anything, the opposite is correct. But regardless of the motivations that we're going to skip today as well, because we don't have time to cover everything we would like to. Religious persecutions escalated with Matthias' ascension, as you know. Although he encountered resistance across his domains, the emperor provoked the strongest opposition in Bohemia by undermining the religious concessions outlined in Rudolf II's Letter of Majesty, issued in 1609, which had guaranteed Protestants the right to practice their faith and build churches on royal lands. Even this was indeed excessive. Matthias began by revoking the Protestants' right to build places of worship on church or crown-owned land, violating the letter's provisions. It was the most sensible and immediate thing to do. He then imposed censorship on religious publications, targeting Protestant pamphlets, and barred non-Catholics from holding civil office, effectively marginalizing Protestant elites. Finally, after Matthias stripped them of the right to present grievances, a right previously upheld by Bohemian estates, Bohemia's Protestants decided to take action. That's how on May 23rd, 1618, after the government demolished two Protestant churches in Hradište and Brumov, a group of nobles led by figures like Count Heinrich Matthias von Thurn stormed Prague's Radzani castle and confronted Matthias' representatives, Willem Slavata and Jaroslav Martinich, in their chambers. Following a heated confrontation, they threw both men, along with their secretary, Philip Fabricius, out of a window. As the tree plummeted 60 feet into the dry moat below, one of the rebels mocked, "See if your Virgin Mary will help you now." And actually, the survival of all three, which was sustaining only minor injuries, sparked a wave of pamphlets claiming that witnesses had seen angels descending from the heavens to cushion their fall. The Defenestration of Prague definitely stands out as one of the single most momentous and symbolic, meaningful actions in the history of modern Europe. The Protestant version of the survival was that the two had landed, falling from the window on a pile of manure, right? And this was eventually even recognized by some Catholic propagandists later on as still a divine protection of some sort. But this was neither the first nor the last defenestration in Prague's history. I also made a video about Meyring's Walpurgisnacht that tells you a bit about sort of the hidden blood running by really intolerance beneath Prague in a metaphysical sense. In 1419, the Hussites had launched their rebellion by throwing Catholic officials from the new town hall. And 3 centuries later, in 1948, the Communists consolidated their power by pushing Czechoslovakia's foreign minister, Jan Masaryk, to his death. Although they claim that he jumped, but of course communists lie just by default. This seems relevant in the perspective of the events, regardless of the difference. Because in a similar way, the Bohemian rebels of 1618 intended their act to signify a definitive break with established authority, which evidently also means that, of course, while having the support of their the local estates, they were definitely seeing the imperial authority as infringing on their Protestant privileges. A quickly convened Diet dominated by Protestant noblemen promptly established a new government under a directorate of 30 members and raised an army of approximately 16,000 men to defend the region, soon joined by Silesia, the Lusatians, and eventually Moravia, where Protestant estates rallied to the cause. So again, rather than seeing this as just Protestant, it's profitable to see it in a broader Bohemian crown land fashion, as if, again, the Hussite issue had never truly ended. And this was the actual problem in many ways. The way the Habsburgs had come to rule over the Bohemian crown lands, as we've seen, had been relatively sudden, also because the Hussites had literally destroyed the country that could not properly defend itself by itself, but it had fragmented things so much that not even the Habsburgs had this particularly tight control. And when we've looked at the 16th, 17th century, Central Europe realized that all these estates were basically floating, although in a very relatively static way, just one intermittent capacity of the Habsburgic dynasty to exert some power and to mostly profit from it by providing concessions to these communities, indebting themselves further. So what happened in 1618, again, I cannot resume simply in a video like this, but it had to do with the same mistakes that the Habsburgs had previously committed, and this was definitely a very important chance of redemption that would yield particular fruits, to say the least, as you know, because this basically open to the Habsburgic success in the entirety of Germany. And with that, basically with the empire, because as you know, Italy was in part shared with the Spanish, but it largely belonged to the Holy Roman Empire. And so there, the possibility of especially bringing Germany under like a unitary Catholic hegemony was basically established. It was factually accomplished, right, before external intervention. Nevertheless, the Habsburgs faced further challenges in 1618 as their North Bohemian crown lands responded to this uprising. In fact, the nobles of both archduchies, that is to say, Austria and Styria and Hungary, reacting to religious persecution in their own regions, allied with the Bohemians for mutual protection against the dynasty, forming a confederation in 1619. This, again, did not control the entirety of the system. The concept of majority is relative because it's mostly like elements of a mechanism rather than specific communities that are intended as a whole. It was difficult for everybody involved. As Matthias sought allies, only Catholic Croatia, however, in the moment, loyal to, as we've seen, to its Catholic majority, and the Habsburg archdukes governing Inner Austria and the Tyrol remained loyal. The former also were, the latter were particularly important. In the midst of this crisis, all Habsburg territories came under a single ruler, though. the unmarried Archduke Maximilian of Tyrol died in 1618, followed by Emperor Matthias on March 20th, 1619. This is the moment in which, as we've seen, basically the Habsburgs, not for the first time in their history, recompacted their family estates under what had become at this point also the imperial authority. The Tyrolean line had been established by Ferdinand the First, and it had ended in 1595. Rudolf II had, however, transferred Tyrol and Outer Austria to his younger brother Maximilian in 1602, and so the split had occurred. Now, under different circumstances, Matthias' death might have calmed his rebellious subjects, but this was not the case when this occurred in 1690. Before his death, the childless emperor had named his cousin, Archduke Ferdinand, as his successor. Ferdinand, after 2 decades of determined persecution, including the 1600 closure of Protestant churches in Styria, had nearly eliminated Protestantism among the general population of his inner Austrian lands, proving that, again, this reversal was actually feasible and that numbers were not, of course, what even these sovereigns at the time really reasoned like. This makes just for, it's typical of moderns to make stats and to attribute too much importance to what numbers of people rather than the quality of people is involved. Rulers at the time understood this very well, and they definitely knew what they were doing. Although a Bohemian Diet had elected Ferdinand as Matthias' heir in 1617 already, under pressure to secure Habsburg succession, the nobility now refused to accept a ruler certain to intensify the oppression of their Protestant population, as his previous deeds had prefigured. In August 1619, as German princes elected Ferdinand as Holy Roman Emperor, as Ferdinand II, 1619-1637. We are in Frankfurt, by the way. So again, in the full blessing, let's say, probably of the most important kingdom, at least in considering also its size in the empire, the rebellious Bohemian estates declared his earlier election as King of Bohemia null and void, which is funny because first, for political machinations, you want him rather than the other candidate, but then now that he's been elected, now you don't want it anymore, right? Just see how instrumental this confessional story as well was. The Bohemians, in fact, first offered the Bohemian crown to the Lutheran elector John George of Saxony, who wisely declined to challenge his new emperor, fearing imperial retribution, also showing that, indeed, at the time, Habsburgic power was absolutely capable of succeeding even in northern Germany. Aside, we'll see now the Spanish backing, there was a pretty solid bedrock of Habsburgic power in Germany, right, resting on its own legs. Besides, I made some video explaining how the whole story of the Nassau military influence in northern Germany among the Protestants was basically shattered for the propaganda that it was when the northern German armies faced, the Catholic ones, and probably also the German ones, and were shattered. In fact, for essentially the feudal levies that they were still. Like, again, northern Germany were incredibly primitive, and in that sense also backward in military organization. So again, things were not easy for anyone involved. Like here we're speaking of the problems of the Habsburgs, but they had a lot, right? As other states in Germany barely they could unite, leagues, etc., but they had their own specific limits, and also general international isolation as Protestants themselves. Now, notoriously, I also made a video about the commanders of the 30 Years' War that talk about him, even though he was definitely not he was the worst of them all. The Bohemian estates found a willing candidate in the young and bold Calvinist elector Frederick V of the Palatinate. That was yet another of that circle of... he was a cousin of the Nassaus, etc. Whose easternmost territories, so the Upper Palatinate specifically, bordered Bohemia as well through central Germany, and whose marriage to Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of King James I of England, gave him a prominent Protestant profile. This because, by the way, not just she was such an important figure internationally, but for dynastic reasons that would confer anyone that prestige, but because she was an icon of pan-European Protestantism as well. So it's interesting to look at English history on another occasion to explain better how, again, how thin the balance in the counter really was, considering that formally the kingdom was Protestant, but as you know, at least the Stuart kings were crypto Catholics, to say the least. They also navigated a bit along the edge of what was really possible and dared where they could. Despite warnings from nearly everyone, basically, including the princes of the Evangelical Union, so the Protestant alliance formed 1608 already back in the day to safeguard the interest of this confession in Germany, Frederick accepted the crown of Bohemia and was crowned, in fact, in Prague's St. Vitus Cathedral, where on November the 4th, 1619. The reason why it was understood by the same Protestants that the situation in Bohemia was more disadvantageous than it seemed really is that, again, the Habsburgs were really mounting up quite important forces that, especially for the Protestants, seemed very difficult to match. It's not like the latter wouldn't make an effort, though. History has justly criticized Frederick for reckless, if not even traitorous actions that transformed the Bohemian revolt from a localized religious war into a broader German civil one, marking the start of the 30 Years' War itself, 1618-48. At the time, however, he seemed to hold a stronger position than his Habsburg rival in a certain way. This is what the Protestants hoped, without, however, being necessarily fully in for sustaining this cause, considering the enormous costs. In June 1619, Bohemian rebel forces led by Count von Thurn had encircled Ferdinand's new capital, Vienna, and only the timely arrival of Styrian cavalry under Archduke Ferdinand's loyal general, Johann Tsercles, prevented his capture. We talked about him the best commanders of the 30 Years' War. Moreover, with 25,000 troops raised by the Bohemian crown lands and his own resources, Frederick could count on support from discontented Protestants across the monarchy. At the time of his election, Gabriel Bethlen, 1639-29, the Calvinist Prince of Transylvania, and thus a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, had invaded Royal Hungary, so the Habsburgic-controlled one, in support of the Protestant cause, capturing Pressburg, that is today's Bratislava, capital of Slovakia, basically would be Upper Hungary. We are in August of 1619. This seemed actually the most threatening strail of this Protestant counter-strike. By October, in fact, Bethlen had united with Bohemian and Lower Austrian Protestant nobles to besiege the same Vienna for the second time, and came really very close to topple Habsburgic rule there. Things could have really escalated in a ruinous fashion for the Habsburgs. In January 1620, Hungarian nobles gathered at Neusel that is Banska Bystrica, and following, because these are all names that were known in, just like Pressburg in German, right? Given the German hegemony on these Slavic and Hungarian territories. Anyway, and following the Bohemian precedent, the throned Ferdinand, electing Bethlen as their king, right? So as King of Hungary, in a direct challenge to Habsburg authority. Needless to say, the Ottomans were behind this, even though, as we've seen, the Turks were also not fully capable of intervening in the 30 Years' War. I also made a video about this, explaining it. I think it's called Brutality from Ukraine to Mesopotamia, that shows a bit that Ottoman commitment towards the East, far from Vienna in that moment. Despite their earlier allegiance to Ferdinand I, who had secured the Bohemian and Hungarian crowns in 1526, the Bohemian Diet and the Assembly at Neusoll invoked their kingdom's elective rights, rooted in medieval traditions, to oust the Habsburgs and choose a new dynasty. Interestingly enough, regardless of also some German support, these were kingdoms that didn't really have the same importance in the picture as the same ensemble of Habsburgic Erbländer, so to say, which were also more internationally interconnected and linked with the right channels of Catholic support. Through Frederick V and Gabriel Bethlen, the Bohemian rebels secured foreign support themselves to resist the Habsburgs, much like the Hungarian supporters of János Zápolya, who invited the Turks in 1529 to counter Habsburg claims after the Battle of Mohács, as a matter of fact. Like his namesake a century earlier, Ferdinand II lacked in that moment the resources to counter this opposition. Money was critical. Although the reunited Tyrolian lands remained loyal and provided some troops, this was definitely a land, first of all, a bit too far away from Bohemia, and also too small just to be sufficient. Inner Austria supported Ferdinand, but its Protestant-dominated estates, wary of alienating the religious allies, were hesitant to act against their co-religionists. Also, proving that that wasn't properly the only the confession wasn't the only motivation of theirs. By early 1620, even Croatia's previously loyal Catholic estates faltered, threatening to seize the military border from Inner Austria and subdue its Free Orthodox Serb Grenza, who served as frontier militias under privileges granted in 1578. Given the alignment of forces within the monarchy, Ferdinand II appeared powerless to prevent its disintegration, or at the very least a complete surrender to his Protestant subjects. Ferdinand and the monarchy were preserved, however, in 1620, and on multiple occasions thereafter by the timely intervention of foreign allies whose interests aligned with its survival. The first military aid came in late 1619, and not actually from the other Habsburgs, but from the Catholic King Sigismund III Vasa of Poland. This was a devout Catholic who launched raids into Upper Hungary and Transylvania, right? So across the Carpathians, across the Sudeten, forcing Bethlen to retreat from Vienna to protect his own territories. Very interesting Polish connection, by the way, that is reminiscent also what we see in 1683, but in very different ways, telling the truth. In fact, this was a spontaneous, if anything, intervention really dictated by a general understanding that a more Protestant Germany would have not really been a good place to be, and it would have really changed too much, like would have brought to so much instability in the West, and just being against at least a largely Catholic Poland. Besides, there were also yet closer Catholic allies to Austria. Maximilian of Bavaria, leader of the Catholic League, formed in 1609 to counter the aforementioned Protestant influence, committed to mobilizing his forces, alarmed that Frederick's control of Bohemia would give, of course, Protestants a 4-3 majority in the Electoral College, as dictated by the Golden Bull, which regulated, as you know, the election of the Holy Roman Emperor, right? Later in the 18th century, would even be a Bavarian emperor, as a matter of fact, was a brief interludium between what was essentially a continuous Habsburgic imperial domination. This is fascinating because, especially in Bavaria, we're seeing some of the richest and most developed, in this sense, more Catholic systems out there that, although having some, of course, beef with the Habsburgs historically, were here incredibly helpful. This complicates, by the way, the picture for the Protestants, of course, but also in terms of, say, objective complexity, our own as well, meaning that when you think about Central Europe, you have to imagine this radically intertwined system where you can't even simply find isolated powers carrying on a struggle without the neighbors having something to say about the possible outcome. By March 1620, oddly enough, Ferdinand had also secured the support of the Lutheran elector John George of Saxony, the same guy who had been called by the Bohemians at some point, who was offended by Frederick's militant Calvinism, though. And again, it's not, as you understand it, like Protestantism was, a single thing. It was, of course, much more sectarian than Catholicism. And it maintained, of course, a beef with the guy who had basically stepped up to the Bohemian throne in his stead, with this much more radical ideology that was definitely too distasteful, even for a Protestant like him. This is important because Lutheranism at that point constituted sort of the most moderate, relevant part of Protestantism in Germany. Besides, there was a blatant violation of imperial law by accepting the Bohemian crown, like that. Maximilian offered to conquer Bohemia proper, while John George agreed to pacify Silesia and the Lusatias, both Bohemian territories with significant Protestant populations. This is really interesting. It brings me back to the 13th century when, Brandenburg, and so was not Brandenburg, but Saxony, let's say, as a northeastern German power, would share the control of Bohemia with the Austrian Habsburgs that weren't even Austrians, as you know, but Alsatian after the Battle of Markfeld, right? So it's not like the two sides liked each other too much, but even from a geographical point of view, you understand that troubles in Bohemia during, again, this terrible war that cost so much to the Calvinists as well, also to the Hussites, so this most radical fringe, would allow a more stable power like Saxony to at least intervene in that northern frontier, the same Bohemian crown, that was difficult to rule even from Bohemia, that at large had been, say, as we've seen, had given up its sort of broader dominion over the crown, its own crown lands in favor at least of a broader Habsburgic dynastic effort to keep things together, but with great difficulty, because especially Silesia, the Lusatias were quite autonomous. Besides, as we've seen, the Poles were intervening, and historically they had themselves beefs with the Bohemian crown land regarding the status of certain Silesian district. That's also another story. Whereas the Habsburgs still controlled Vienna, of course, needed some kind of support from Saxony. This looked like a pincer movement against Prague. Now, the price of this support by the way, was high but justified. Maximilian was promised the permanent transfer of the Palatinate's electoral dignity, one of 7 votes in the electoral college, and the right to seize Frederick's German lands, including the Upper and Lower Palatinate. Ferdinand also agreed to pawn Upper Austria to Bavaria and the Lusatias to Saxony as financial guarantees. Thus, in part, the Habsburgs were forfeiting some imperial rights to these other, like to the Bavarians, to the Saxons, and so even to, like in the latter case, potential enemies, also in the former one, potential competitors. However, fashion was greatly helping them in the moment, and that therefore was the best thing to do. This was a great success, right? However, the also broader international alignment of the Habsburgs brought to, in fact, like their namesake, like in Spain, to intervene in support of Austria. In fact, support from the Spanish Habsburgs came with fewer strings, and for good reason. At the time, King Philip III of Spain, 1598-1621, saw the Austrian Habsburgs as essentially allies in the ongoing war with the Dutch, right? The famous 80 Years' War, 1568-1648. I made multiple videos about Dutch warfare during this period, but we really have to get much more in depth as far as proper, say, evidential history is concerned there. Frederick V was a natural adversary whose Rhenish territories threatened supply lines known as the Spanish Road between Spanish holdings in Italy, specifically Milan, the most important state, at least in the north, and the Netherlands. So obviously this king of the Nassaus was basically blocking the passage from the of the Tercios from some of the most obvious bases in Europe, controlled by the Spanish, the richest northern Italy. It was an imperial territory, but allowed by the Austrian Habsburgs to the Spanish, administratively speaking. By 1620, Philip had dispatched one army from each region, led by commanders like Ambrosio Spinola, an Italian commander, one of the great Italian commanders at the service of the Habsburgs. I will resume a bit of this. I have something in store about Raimondo Montecuccolo. As a matter of fact, it was a veritable warhound from Modena. Spinola, as you know, would, there is the Surrender of Bread as one of the most famous paintings of the era, like illustrating his accomplishment. Plus, there was a third force to conquer, the Palatinate, totaling over 20,000 troops. I just recently made a video about the size of early modern armies, and we noticed that regardless of course, of the fine tercios recruited from Spain, from Italy, from, say, Germany, etc., like the overall size is not of this army is considered that Spain is really the strongest power around here. And it's investing a lot. We're not particularly huge armies, right? We've seen that also the Protestant forces were not totaling more than 20,000 troops. Besides, we're talking pretty stretched scenarios. So it's not like these forces were entirely concentrated in a specific point most of the time. In any case, with such assistance, it was really formidable. So surpassing the forces of the Protestants had put together against, like in Bohemia, Southeast Germany, to try at the same Vienna, with admittedly other contendants, as we've seen the Transylvanians. There are the Catholic Poles helping the Habsburgs as well. Ferdinand had little need for his own forces either, so in a way he was able to save himself. He had some forces to defend Vienna, to operate, as we've seen from other provinces in the Upland, but this broader international help was quite substantial and majority. Nevertheless, substantial subsidies from Philip III 1.2 million florins, equivalent to really millions in modern currency as well. And Pope Paul V will make a video about his pontificate, 380,000 florins, reflecting papal fears of Protestant ascendancy, but also how the important the papal financial support was really to the Catholic world at this point, and also later on we've seen it in the video about Vienna as well, enabled Ferdinand to maintain an army of his own as well, right? Mostly made up of mercenaries, as it was really typical in the era, and some of these people would be German, would be also Austrian themselves. It's not like they were necessarily foreigners, but that's how the backbone of the militaries of the era went. Made so many videos again about the same topic. While Ferdinand assembled this formidable coalition, we've seen also how costly it was. Frederick grew increasingly isolated instead. The kings of England, James I, and France, Louis XIII, wary of noble rebellions against legitimate rulers, provided no support, and even convinced the Evangelical Union to abandon Frederick, fearing his actions would destabilize the whole Roman Empire entirely. This is incredibly fascinating because you immediately see that, aside from England, that was again a nominally Protestant force, regardless of the Stuarts, crypto-Catholicism we're talking about, France was already, siding, as you know, towards that tendentially pro-Protestant or rather anti-Habsburgic direction. But they wouldn't do anything because this was a phase where the concept of regicide was pretty widespread. You think about also in the times of Hobbes, but this bit later. But in let's say the idea we saw it also with the assassination of Louis XIII's father, Henry IV of Bourbon, was an actually concrete thing. The same mother of James I, as you know, had been put to death by Elizabeth. So again, brutal times, and the notion was that if we support these rebels, regardless of the context, against the legitimate rulers of the whole Roman empires, not just we can cause a terrible mess that we have to intervene in, which means in any case more money to spend to provide support to this or that faction, but we're also essentially fueling the notion that a legitimate ruler, especially such a traditional one like the Holy Roman Emperor, could be put down just out of a whim, right? And if you look at how the conflict escalated in the empire, you realize this had been a particularly brusque and quick issue, regardless of Matthias and Ferdinand's intolerance and sort of decisive action. The reaction had been equally quick and risking to engulf, as it would actually happen in the longer run, the whole freaking Europe in this. Meanwhile, Frederick undermined his own popularity in Bohemia in different ways. First of all, he failed to restrain his soldiers from plundering. This was a grievous issue because we're not yet in the age of military barracks. This guy has already arrived in Bohemia from basically another country. He's not much of a commander at all. He entrusts the military direction of this to other generals. He's a good administrator, if anything, a logistician or something like that. But this is the measure also of how scarce resources were to properly satisfy to maintain the soldiers that could barely at that point be restrained, especially in what seemed like, again, a free-for-all. This revolt was incredibly violent, as we've seen, ideologically driven. So there was really very strong hatred, very strong feelings from both sides. This would have not escalated hadn't this been really that vicious and brutal. This, however, alienated local populations, as we've seen, by majority Protestant, even though, of course, the Protestants mostly target the Catholics. Frederick also had a disdain for his Lutheran, but also Utraquist subjects, as we've seen before, so much so that Protestant Saxony would go against him. As a Calvinist, he despised the Hussites. He really thought they were savages. He was habituated to a sort of almost like properly Western rather than Central European mentality in the Palatinate. So this was not like a very good precondition for the unity of the cause. With the onset of the campaigning season, the end came swiftly for the so-called Winter King, a nickname mocking his brief reign, again between 1619 and 1620. Maximilian seized Upper Austria and the Upper Palatinate with his splendid force. The Spanish overran the Rhenish Palatinate by late 1620. So literally, the Spaniards march into the same residence of Frederick, and the Saxons mind their own business by advancing the Lusatias and Silesias, wilder, more peripheral areas, but still indeed undermining the power of the Bohemian crown lands. On November the 8th, 1620, a combined Spanish and Catholic League army under Count Tilly, a seasoned commander, famously defeated the large but poorly trained rebel forces of around 15,000 at the Battle of White Mountain, overlooking Prague, in just 1 hour, thanks to superior discipline and tactics. With Bohemia lost and his German territories under Spanish and Bavarian control, Frederick was forced to flee in exile to the Hague, never to return. By the way, living in poverty henceforth, marking a decisive Habsburg victory that reshaped the course of the 30 Years' War. And by the way, having highlighted the incredible power of the Catholic alliance Europe-wide. We started from, again, this precarious situation in which Vienna seemed to be lost, etc. But some of the other Protestant princes, as well as other foreign powers, had seen it right. You know, the Habsburgs with their Catholic allies, Poland, Bavaria, and especially the Spanish Empire, would really pour on the Protestants, so, participating to Frederick V's enterprise, a hell, right, of pike and shot, so to say, in this context, which was really like the Battle of the White Mountain. We'll have to, in fact, perhaps we'll make this next. You know, wouldn't be the first battle of the 30 Years' War on Schwerpunkt, but given this video could actually be the same. And so this really shows you how powerful and successful the imperial front really was, how solid the Habsburgic connections were across Europe, what kind of support could arrive from Spain, from the papacy, and generally speaking, how messy Central Europe really were. That's also why before I was saying that the notion that the majority of the inhabitants here were Protestant didn't really matter. Right, as I was saying before, regardless of ideology, it's not like if people have an opinion, that opinion is solid enough, it means you're absolutely that, you believe that. Absolutely not, right? You're going basically to just get into the meat grinder in the eye of the storm, and at that point, all that BS that you believed, you will forget or bend to other ideas just in the moment, because after all, you don't even know what you're talking about most of the times. Voice in charge has a completely different touch, like of the pulse, so is going to do more. It's not, again, like the Protestants hadn't succeeded, as we've seen, to threaten even the same Vienna that almost fell to the Transylvanian Protestants. However, things turned out pretty ruinously, with literally like the Palatinate as a Protestant power overrun by the Spaniards. This during the 80 Years' War, by the way, the Protestant forces in Central Europe annihilated at the Battle of the White Mountain the the Austrian Habsburgs maintaining this stronger force with which they could held sway across Germany. And as you know, this would open also to another era, because the Spanish in Heidelberg were sort of a bit of a problem for other powers involved, and here the Habsburgs were getting too much power for, in fact, other international forces to remain simply watching. And that's also yet another indicator of how much thickly intertwined Europe was already by this point, is how simultaneous relations, influences, reactions, etc., would be in all this system. It's important to have covered this topic. I will, it was a while we didn't talk about the Habsburgs, just per se, but looking at the beginning of the 30 Years' War, I think, is one of those topics that really matter. And restoring this more evidential narrative is, again, extremely, extremely important. I don't know how long this video is. I don't think we made it 2 hours. No, we haven't. Almost, though. And so, again, this is good. But we will see all this better, and we will absolutely get into it more thoroughly, even especially from a military point of view. For today, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.